the second day of Shavuot, 1968, June the 3rd, 1968. According to the biblical account of the history of our people, the religion of Israel begins with a bang and ends with a whimper. The magnificent series of theophanies to the patriarchs, to Moses, to the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, all these manifestations and revelations of God are followed immediately by the sin of the golden calf and the consistent spiritual decline of the people. One might draw a graph of the spiritual progress of our ancestors as described in the Bible, beginning with Abraham, through Isaac, Jacob, rising through Moses, through the revelation of the Decalogue on Mount Sinai. A high point is reached in the spiritual existence of our people, the highest point when God speaks to the whole people assembled. And then there is a rapid decline, the sin of the golden calf, the wandering in the wilderness, the sins for which the people were exiled from the land, and ever afterwards further and further decline. That is the biblical graph of the spiritual history of our people, and according to traditionalist Jews, we are still a people in exile because of our sins, awaiting God's mercy to deliver us and redeem us. Although the number of consistently traditionalist Jews in this theological respect probably relates exclusively to some Orthodox Jews known as Naturi Karta, who still refuse to accept the theological implication on any level of Zionism. The scholarly critical theory of the spiritual development of our people tells quite a different story. According to the critical theory, the biblical account of a rising graph of spirituality suddenly ended by the sin of the golden calf and the subsequent exile and further sinning. The critical theory maintains that this graph is tendentious and propagandist. There never was a peak, the scholars argue, at Mount Sinai, for there to have been a subsequent decline. During the first Commonwealth, that is to say, the period of our history up to the 8th pre-Christian century, our ancestors were no different from any other pagans. According to Julius Wellhausen, the distinguished 19th century Bible critic, in the first volume of his History of Israel, published in 1878, a shock from which religious Jewry has not yet recovered, the Mosaic history, that is to say the Pentateuch, that is to say the 5 books of Moses which rest in our ark, Wellhausen says, the Mosaic history is not the starting point for the history of ancient Israel, but for the history of Judaism. The point that he is making, namely, is that Judaism is a relatively late development in history, after the 8th century, and that when Judaism emerged, our ancestors felt a need to rewrite their early history to fit in with what they experienced at that later stage. So that the description of the revelation of Mount Sinai, which we commemorate on this festival of Shavuot, is a retrojection from a later age to make us believe that the Israelites were originally virtuous and only then were backsliding. But in reality, Wellhausen argues, there was nothing at the time of the revelation on Sinai for our ancestors to backslide from. Judaism, on this view, is a late starter, 8th, 7th, or 6th pre-Christian century, and rewrites its origins for theological reasons, much like a man born on the Lower East Side might pretend for social reasons that he was born in Westchester. The history of the relapse theme, that is to say, the graph of Jewish religious experience as an up and then a sharp down, is, however, far too deeply embedded in the Bible for it to be without a kernel of truth. We may indeed surmise that the profound intuition of Moses that there was a God of justice in the world, this experience of our ancestors epitomized in the experience of their spiritual virtuosi, the time of the Exodus from Egypt, that God was a God of the underdog, that justice was not merely a matter of human expediency, but that there were cosmic implications of any event making for justice in human society, that in a civil rights movement or in an exodus from Egypt, there were cosmic implications, and that these cosmic implications were that the universe, the cosmos, was grounded on justice, that regardless of how much injustice there might be in the world, the cosmos was a justice-making cosmos, and that power making for justice was God. That was the Mosaic intuition, and of course Moses was centuries in advance of his time. T.S. Eliot has written, "Each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate with shabby equipment, always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling." The poet, of course, is writing about the difficulty of picking up a pen and a sheet of paper and trying to put down in the cold light of the morning the little bit of poetic inspiration that one had at 3 o'clock in the middle of the night. All creative artists have experienced this difficulty of raiding the inarticulate, trying to express an idea sensed in conceptual extension. Inasmuch as Einstein worked out his theory of relativity first, and then looked around for a geometry in which to express his discovery, Euclidean geometry was no good for his purposes, for Euclidean geometry lacks the concept of curved space, which was precisely what Einstein wished to express. And then, having intuited his theory of relativity, discovering by chance the geometry of Riemann, which quite independently and theoretically had arrived at a geometry suitable for expressing the concept of curved space, so comparably Moses intuits a new dimension of divinity. Yahweh, Jehovah, Adonai, make your pick. The cosmic implications of the Exodus from Egypt. Moses intuits a new theory of religion and then looks around for a religious geometry in which to express it. But Moses was less fortunate than his latter-day Jewish successor Einstein. His raid on the inarticulate, in the words of Eliot, was unaccompanied by the discovery of a language of religion adequate to express it. Moses, unlike Einstein, could not discover in his age a way of life which could adequately embody this spiritual insight. His intuition had to find expression in existing religious language, which was inherently unsuitable for it. This would be like Einstein having to express the theory of relativity in Euclidean geometry, or a modern space expert having to express the motions of Telstar in pre-Copernican astronomy. It can be done, but who needs it? The result in the sphere of religion, what is known as religious syncretism. Religious syncretism, which is the mingling indiscriminately of different religions and different levels of religion. My late distinguished and much lamented teacher, Dr. Arthur Marmerstein of Jews College London, speaking of Judaism in Anglo Jewry, and I'm sure it doesn't apply to Judaism in American Jewry, said that their Judaism is Christianity minus Jesus plus a bowl of lokshen soup. That is an example of religious syncretism, for Christianity and lokshen soup do not go together. Another example of religious syncretism is when Jews observe Christmas. Ideally speaking, every new intuition requires an entirely new geometry, an entirely new system. Religious syncretism, by definition, is bound to debilitate the pristine purity of the new idea through compromise. Only a few pieces of evidence remain that the original intuition of Moses was meant to be different. The name of God, Yad-He-Vav-He, Yahweh, symbolizes the radical innovation that Moses saw in God. Men had conceived of God before his time, but never had God been experienced previously to such an extent as the God of the underdog, the God of justice. Never had the liberation of any people been experienced as the manifestation on earth of divinity in action. Nevertheless, after the death of Moses, from time to time, religious geniuses sensed the discrepancy between the original Mosaic intuition and the clumsy Euclidean pre-Copernican language in which that insight had perforce to be articulated. The prophets, sensing the discrepancy between what Moses had wanted and what he had to express and what the people made of that expression, became the very consciences of their people. Modern research has greatly enhanced our understanding of the process of syncretism in ancient Israel. Three elements were involved in it. Firstly, there is no doubt at all that our ancestors, inspired by Moses, brought with them to Canaan about the year 1200 before the Common Era certain inchoate, partial traditions about the patriarchs, Egypt, the Exodus, the wilderness, and the wanderings therein, the Ark of Covenant, and all of these ideas and concepts centered around belief in Yahweh, who was God of the underdog. Now, in Canaan, our ancestors found two different kinds of religion. First, they found the religion of Baal, the religion of the fertility rites, sacred prostitution as imitative magic. The deity conceived in the image of a bull. Baal owned the soil. Baal gave rain. And in return for granting the Canaanites who worshipped him, in return for giving the Canaanites who worshipped him crops, rain, and fertility, Baal demanded in return the first fruits of all their harvest and the firstborn of all their animals. Secondly, our ancestors found the Molech religion, from the word melech, Molech religion. If Baal was the god of nature, worship of whom guaranteed successful crops and a profusion of rain, Molech, as his name indicates, was a social god. Molech was conceived as the god who led his people into war and who governed their social relations in peace. He was conceived of as a man, and in recognition of his sovereignty, all firstborn male children had to be offered to him as a sacrifice. We still have a relic of this custom in the ceremony of Pidyon Haben, redeeming the firstborn son. So that at the moment of our ancient entry into Canaan, ancient Canaan, like all Gaul, was divided into three parts. And an ancient Will Herberg, in the 12th pre-Christian century, instead of writing Catholic, Protestant, Jew, could have written Baalist, Molechist, and Yahwist as a title of a best-selling book. But the Yahwist group was the minority group, the latest immigrants, and more importantly, culturally retarded, the Hyman Kaplan of Canaanite civilization. And learning the language, as it were, in public school at night time after long hours of work, this cultural retardation under the impact of a majority civilization worked terrible effects on their own ideas about religion. Their idea of Yahweh was good, but unfortunately they couldn't speak the language, and their ideas of drainage, as we have discovered from archaeology, and architecture were extremely poor. And people do tend to admire a good plumbing system. And therefore our ancestors, because all they had was a concept of God and not a concept of how to build a bathroom, and this has been proven by the deterioration in plumbing conditions when the Israelites took over sites originally controlled by the Canaanites. All because of a lack of a good plumbing system, our ancestors became very prone to religious syncretism. They were impressed by the technology of the majority civilization. And their situation as new immigrants was compounded by their own particular needs in relationship to the dominant religions of Canaan. They had been shepherd nomads, wandering nomads, after which they had done a stint of slavery for 400 years. And now, having wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, they had to adjust to agriculture. And as anyone who has ever gone onto a kibbutz from a sedentary job at college or an office knows, it takes time to adjust to agriculture. And therefore Baal, the god of agriculture, appealed to their economic aspirations. And only this last Sabbath we read in the book of Hosea something of the extent to which the god of fertility, the god of good crops, the god of profusion of rain, profoundly appealed to our Israelite ancestors. So they were pushovers for Baal, as it were. Secondly, as a group of new immigrants in a tribal society, our ancestors had to keep alive their war spirit, their unity, in order to be able to survive physically as a group. And therefore, in addition to the fertility god appealing to our ancestors, Molech, the god of battle, the society god, also appealed to them as a political leader. And two tendencies developed in ancient Israel. The agriculturist Jews, the ones who settled in the agricultural areas, tended to identify the Yahweh God they had brought with them into Canaan with Baal. They combined both elements of worship together. Yahweh and Baal became two sides of the same coin. And Yahweh became the rain giver, but was worshipped as Baal was worshipped. And the more society or social conscious elements in ancient Israel identified Yahweh with Molech. And the ark became conceived in this form of religious syncretism as the seat where Yahweh sat. And you'll remember that in the battle with the Philistines, our ancestors epitomized this union of Yahweh and Molech by taking the ark, which was regarded as the throne of Molech, or the king god, in order that Yahweh, Molech, could help them in their battle with the enemy. Unfortunately, they lost the battle and the ark was captured. Had they left the ark behind, they could have rationalized that it wasn't a real battle, and the next time they would have succeeded. They didn't do it again in a hurry. The religion of Baal had no future among our ancestors. Our ancestors never excluded sex from their concerns, but gross immorality masquerading as religion was always offensive to the spiritual leaders of our people. And on a famous occasion at Mount Carmel, sometime in the 9th pre-Christian century, the prophet of Yahweh, Elijah, thoroughly routed the supporters of Baal, made fools of them, and Baalism was wiped out from among our people. Moloch worship, unfortunately, proved more insidious. The offering of firstborn male sons as living holocausts to Molech was viciously attacked by the prophets. But time and again in the biblical period, it reappeared in crisis. Even as late as the time of Ezekiel, we find the prophet condemning the Jews for introducing this pagan act of worship to Molech. Gradually, a tendency emerged among our people not to eradicate Molochism, but to bring it under the dominion of Yahweh. We often find this tendency in Jewish life. When the spiritual leaders can't beat something, they join them. Yahwism beat or joined Molochism by Yahweh taking on the names and the attributes of Molech. Molech became Melech, and Adonai Melech symbolizes the fusing in a form of religious syncretism, the notion that God, who is also Yahweh, now is the leader of the social aspirations of the Jewish people. And in the reading of the Torah, which describes the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, which we commemorate on the festival of Shavuot, the Jews are described as Mamlechet Kohanim, translated incorrectly in all translations of the Bible as a kingdom of priests. In fact, that phrase descriptive of the Jews as they stood at the foot of Sinai does not mean a kingdom of priests. The word Mamlechet signifies the fusing of Yahweh and Melech. Kohen in this text means neither priest, a man who officiates in a cult, nor judge, as it occasionally means in the Bible, but a friend or associate of royalty. Adonai Melech, Yahweh is king. And an ancient degraded form of religion has become elevated at the foot of Sinai into a new form of religious syncretism. You may call it a compromise, but it was a good compromise. It took the wind out of the sails of the Molochists and made the Jews into Melechists. And sometimes in the history of religion, some forms of compromise are unfortunately necessary. We learn from this blending of Yahweh and Melech as ideal concepts in Jewish life that no ethical intuition, even if it comes from the brain and the mind of a Moses, can exist in a vacuum. It has to be articulated in some language of behavior. No religious intuition, however noble, can escape the law of syncretism. If it is to function in the life of a people, it must be integrated into current reality expressions, with all their defects and limitations. No spiritual leader dare say to those whom he aspires to lead, I have a wonderful idea, which is far in advance of its time. It cannot be implemented because people are not ready for it. There is no suitable language for it. There is no way to argue. Every good idea is in advance of its time, else it wouldn't be a good idea. But it has to take potluck with the language of the marketplace and wrestle with reality, and there survive. There can be no ivory tower for ethical intuitions. If it doesn't have a language, it has to use what is available. We also learn from this fusion of Yahweh with Melech that no matter how lofty or how inspiring an ethical idea from the brain or the mind of a Moses or from any other spiritual genius may be, men can always find ways of degrading it and using it in the interests of dehumanization. It happened in Israel even after the fusion of Yahweh and Melech, that under the pressure of a crisis, a bad harvest, Yahweh would be identified with perverted or criminal notions. And a classical example of this is when Jephthah invokes the name of Yahweh to perform an act of Molech when he offers to sacrifice his own daughter for the granting of a victory against his enemies. The fusing of Yahweh and Melech cries out to us over the centuries, do not ask of any individual or of any institution what their ideology is in theory. Theoretical ideology is meaningless. They are six a penny. Find out how that ideology operates and functions in the life of that group. An ethical intuition is meaningless in a vacuum. It is meaningless save insofar as it functions in the lives of a group ethically. The way to hell is paved with immorally implemented ethical intuitions. And from the fusion of Yahweh and Melech, we also learn that in this victory of Melech over the other contender, Baal and the fertility rites, there is the victory of society over nature. There are two kinds of men living in our world. There are those who, I regret to say, are probably in the majority, who believe that true, authentic human fulfillment lies in the sphere of technology, the manipulation of the physical world, man's control over nature. That, they say, is what will achieve paradise for mankind and usher in the age of utopia. The computers, the machines, advanced technology. And there is another group, a smaller group, who, while they do not turn their back on technology and the splitting of the atom and the invention of all the fabulous technological equipment of our age, nevertheless say, all this advanced technology will not be of avail to you unless you order your human relationships with each other properly. The creative control of human nature, human interpersonal relationships, is more important than creating vast machines for the controlling of the impersonal forces of nature. It is the tradition of the Jew that peace on earth should always take prior place to men on the moon, and that man's control of himself and man's control of his society should always take precedence over man's control of nature. And that belief in the superiority of social control over technological control reflects the ancient belief in the ultimate conquest of Baal, the god of impersonal nature, by Melech, the god of the right ordering of society. Shavuot, which we commemorate this day, is known in rabbinic tradition as the Atzeret, the concluding festival of Passover, which, as you all know, is the festival of freedom. Pesach symbolizes Yahweh, God making for freedom. And we hear a great deal about freedom today. Everybody wants freedom. Sometimes the demand for freedom reminds me of the old story my father used to tell me about a meeting where a man at the back of a crowded hall was shouting, "We want unity!" And he shouted so long and so loud that he finally disrupted the meeting. And the chairman of the proceedings thought that he would silence him by asking him a question. It's always a good way to silence a speaker, by asking him a question. And the chairman of the proceedings said to this man who kept on shouting out, "We want unity." He said, "My dear friend, what is unity?" To which the shouter said, "Never mind, we want unity." And sometimes to hear our young and middle-aged and old, the aberrations in our society today, shouting, "We want freedom." And when we pause for a moment and we say, "What do you mean by freedom?" and they say, "Never mind, we want freedom," there's an element of destruction. The name of Yahweh, which was meant to stand for responsible freedom, has, as in the case of Jephthah in the Bible, been dragged down to stand for a perverted form of Molochism, a society which demands the spilling of blood for its proper functioning. Shavuot is the Atzeret of Pesach. Shavuot reminds us that freedom has to have a meaning. It cannot be the wild aspirations of the individual or even of the ethnic group. A lot of us are very upset because the mayor is not allowing us to park on the wrong side of the road on the Jewish festivals. Here you have a perfect example. If it's in the best interest of the citizens of New York as a whole that the streets should be kept clean, then that is more important than the Jews who don't want to drive on Shavuot should have to put their cars in the garage. It's not always what the Jews want should come first. Other people also exist in this city, and their needs have to be taken in consultation with others. And by the same token, the Yahweh expressed in Pesach, sure of freedom, but whether on the level of the individual or on the level of the ethnic group, it must be a freedom compatible with the needs of freedom for a total society. And sometimes what is freedom for the whole society may often feel like a little less than freedom from the point of view or the standpoint of the individual or from the ethnic group. Shavuot complements Pesach by telling us that freedom without discipline is anarchy. Once again, in our streets, the old gods are walking. Baal operates again in our society. Perhaps it would be unfair to call Baal the playboy syndrome. But certainly insofar as there is rampant in modern life a belief that the greatest profligacy and immorality in sexual life, so long as it can be explained in sophisticated language, somehow makes it right and proper, is an almost exactly equivalent functional analogy to the ancient immorality subsumed under Baal worship. As long as it was under the guise of religion, it was justified. And both the latter-day sophisticated apologists for the new immorality and the old preachers of the gospel of libertinism find rationales to prove their points. Molech also, as well as Baal, walks in the streets. We see in the aberrations of the new left, we see in the aberrations of those who want freedom regardless of whether that entails the destruction of the very institutions they are supposed to be reconstructing and reforming. Molech, that destructive element in society. Shavuot teaches us that Yahweh and Melech are both God, that the desire in man for freedom comes from God, and the desire in man for the establishment, to have a properly organized society, also comes from God. And Pesach and Shavuot must be linked. It cannot be either Pesach or Shavuot. It cannot be either for the establishment and against those who speak for freedom, or entirely freedom against the establishment. Yahweh and Melech must function creatively together if the needs of the individual are to be blended creatively with the ongoing needs of society. We pray that our analysis and consideration of the implication of Yahweh and Melech accepted by our ancestors at the foot of Sinai and in the biblical era of our civilization lead us also in our own relations with our family, community, and society to bring near the day when not only for the Jew but for all mankind, Adonai Melech, freedom will be reconciled with law, and God truly will reign. Amen.